Morning, all. All right, so we're going to talk about the 1937-1938 season. It's the season that sees an unlikely Stanley Cup winner, considering the standings and all that. So we're going to go over that first. This is also the final season. You're going to see divisions on this board until I get to the 1967-68 season. So 30 years before we'll have divisions in the NHL again. Everybody gets dropped into one division next year after the Montreal Maroons are done. You're not going to have a 3-team division, so yeah, 7 teams end up being just thrown into one division. There is no separating out. Now, the Canadian division, the last year in its existence, Toronto wins it. 24-15-9 record, 57 points, 151 goals scored, 127 goals against. The New York Americans, 19-18-11 for 49 points. They scored 110 goals, allowed 111. The Montreal Canadiens, 18-17-13 record. They also had 49 points, scoring 123 goals and allowing 128. The Montreal Maroons go 12-30-6 in their final season for 30 points. Even had an 8-game losing streak in there. Tried changing coaches during the season. Nothing worked. They scored 101 goals and allowed 149. In the American division, Boston finishes first, and they were the best team in the league, meaning, of course, they don't win the Stanley Cup. 30-11-7 record, 67 points, 142 goals scored, 89 goals against. And again, historically, when Boston finishes first, they don't win in the playoffs. No idea why. At some point in time this summer, maybe I'll take a look at teams that finish first in the NHL and don't win in the playoffs, like don't win a Stanley Cup, and Boston's probably going to finish first in that too. The New York Rangers, 27-15-6 for 60 points. They scored 149 goals and allowed 96. The Chicago Blackhawks, they go 14-25-9 on the season for 37 points. They score 97 goals and allow 139. The worst goal differential in the National Hockey League. The Detroit Red Wings, almost. No, Montreal Maroons had a mildly worse goal differential. Apologies. The Detroit Red Wings, 12-25-11. They had 35 points, so they finished 2 back of Chicago. 99 goals scored, 133 goals against. So, absolutely remarkable that I'm wearing a Chicago Blackhawks jersey, isn't it? This was a team that during the regular season didn't perform well at all, and then they turn it on in the playoffs. Again, when that happens in the NHL, people get kind of upset. Why is that team even in the playoffs? They don't belong there. I can't. So if that had happened now, right? So the season starts with an All-Star game. It's the Howie Morenz Memorial All-Star game. It raised over $11,000 for his family, which added to other funds, added up to about $20,000 going to the Morenz family. And you know what? That's a good story. And it does, hearing about how the All-Star game started, you had the Ace Bailey fundraiser, now the Howie Morenz fundraiser. Could the NHL All-Star game be used as like a fundraiser again? Could the NHL do something like we talk about how the All-Star game doesn't really mean anything and it's not all that entertaining. What if you had it as a fundraiser? What if you had it where it was a charity event? What if you had it maybe in a third party like you had it somewhere that they don't have an NHL team right now, like I don't know, Hamilton, Quebec City, something like just something different with the All-Star game like that. Anyways, just spitballing. You guys can let me know your thoughts. Eddie Shore returns from a serious back injury and wins his final Hart Trophy that season with Boston, of course. Hawks goaltender Mike Caracas gets hurt during the playoffs, and they had to turn to Alfie Moore in the final where he won a game. The next game he was declared ineligible, so they had to throw in like the emergency backup to the emergency backup, because remember, this is a time before you had to have a backup goaltender on the bench. Caracas would return. He had a broken toe. They actually had a modified skate so he could play with a broken toe because Moore was not eligible. But Moore did win the game that he played in the Stanley Cup final, so folk hero was born. The E-Bug before the E-Bug, right? March 13th of 1938, rookie Carl Lidstrom of the Detroit Red Wings sets an NHL record with 3 goals in a minute and 52 seconds. It's a record that lasts for about 14 years before it gets beaten, and of course we'll talk about that when we get there. Bill Mosienko with the record, of course. But yeah, at the time, Carl Lidstrom, as a rookie, not too shabby. December 31st, 1937, Chicago's Paul Thompson scores on his brother, Tiny Thompson of the Boston Bruins, of course, And that's a first, a brother scoring on a brother. We see that now. It's not necessarily a huge deal when it happens. It's something we keep an eye on, but yeah, it's just interesting to see that it happened in 1937 for the first time. March 17th of 1938. That's an interesting date for two reasons. First off, Nels Stewart becomes the first in NHL history to reach 300 career goals. And also on that day, Montreal faces Montreal for the final time, the Habs and the Maroons. So again, maybe we should start to bring back the Maroons campaign, right? And how great would that be just to have a Montreal? Like, I would love to see the Habs do like a tribute to the Maroons because they were in the league for a long time. But, anyways, that's their final meeting on March 17th. As you can see, the Maroons do not make the playoffs. Detroit gets some fame this season, but not for a reason they'd be happy about. They become the first team to ever miss the playoffs the year after they win the Stanley Cup. So that is a first. It's something that we see occasionally in the National Hockey League now, but it does start with Detroit. And this was the year icing was introduced. So just think about how many times you see a puck get iced. Now, imagine if icing wasn't a thing. How often you would see the puck get thrown down the ice. And there are definitely instances where that happened a lot. I know in some historical books that when they brought in icing, it's just because it got ridiculous. The scoring, as you can see, is low. And so if you could just ice the puck and there's no such thing as icing, you're going to do that over and over and over again, especially if you're a defenseman and the team's pinned down a little bit. So, yeah, bringing in icing made a lot of sense. So your first and second team All-Stars that year, Bill Cowley's the first team All-Star down the middle. Sillaps for Toronto is the second team All-Star down the middle. There's two right wingers who tie in the vote for the first All-Star team position. Both Cecil Dillon of the New York Rangers and Gordie Drillin of the Toronto Maple Leafs end up being first star. Paul Thompson of Chicago is the first team All-Star on the left side. Second team is Toe Blake. I have Boston. That's not supposed to be Boston. That's supposed to be Montreal. Toe Blake did not play. Oh, man. The ghost of Toe Blake is now going to exact its revenge. On the blue line, Eddie Shore for Boston and Babe Siebert on the first team. On the second team, Art Coulter for the Rangers and Earl Siebert also for Chicago. In goal, Tiny Thompson for the Boston Bruins is the first team All-Star, and Dave Kerr for the New York Rangers is second team. And honestly, I look at Dave Kerr, and I did look at his bio a little bit on Hockey Reference. I'm surprised he never got in the Hall of Fame. He had over 200 wins. He had a Stanley Cup in there. He had a Vezina Trophy, first team All-Star. Here he's a second team All-Star. I'm kind of surprised he never made the Hall of Fame. So maybe I need to start bringing him up the next time that I talk about not in the Hall of Fame. All right, the Hart Trophy that year, Eddie Shore wins it from Boston, as I previously mentioned. The Calder Trophy goes to Cully Dahlstrom for the Chicago Blackhawks. Vezina goes to Tiny Thompson for Boston. Lady Bing goes to Gordie Drillin for the Toronto Maple Leafs. And for Drillin, he is also the number one scorer in the NHL that year. With Toronto, 48 games, 26 goals, 26 assists, 52 points. Sillaps for Toronto, of course, is second, 47 games, 21 goals, 29 assists, 50 points. Paul Thompson for Chicago is third, 48 games, 22 goals, 22 assists, 44 points. So only two players with point per game that year in the NHL. Georges Mantha for Montreal, 47 games, 23 goals, 19 assists, 42 points. Bill Cowley for Boston, next up, with 48 games, 17 goals, 22 assists, 39 points. Sweeney Schreiner for the New York Americans, 48 games, 21 goals, 17 assists, 38 points. Bill Toms for Toronto, 48 games, 14 goals, 24 assists, 38 points. So there's some decent scorers in there, but yeah, scoring is going to get boosted years later. It's still relatively low, and the goaltenders show that too. Tiny Thompson for Boston, 30, 11, and 7. So again, plays every single game because what's a backup? 1.8 goals against, 7 shutouts. Dave Kerr for the New York Rangers, 27, 15, and 6. So he played every game as well. 1.95 goals against average and 8 shutouts. Turk Broda for Toronto, 24, 15, and 9. Played every game. 2.56 goals against average and 6 shutouts. Now we get to the playoffs. The New York Americans and the New York Rangers squared off in the first round. So what would have happened if they met in the final and the circus is in town? It doesn't happen, but where would you play? So probably Boston. So the New York Americans beat the Rangers in the first game 2-1 in double overtime. The second game, the Rangers beat the Americans 4-3. And in the third game, the Americans beat the Rangers in 4 overtimes by a score of 3-2. And of course, both teams play out of Madison Square Garden, so there's not really a home ice advantage there. I mean, you get last change, but still. And then in the other quarterfinal, Montreal beat Chicago in the first game 6-4 to take a 1-0 series lead. And then Chicago goes home. They beat Montreal 4-0. And then they go into Montreal and win in overtime 3-2 to score a huge upset over Montreal, a team that finished 12 points ahead of them in the regular season. In the semis, you've got the Americans and the Chicago Blackhawks. The Americans win the first game 3-1. So again, in a best-of-3 series, Chicago drops the first game. But Chicago wins the second game in double overtime by a score of 1-0. And then they go in and they beat the New York Americans 3-2 in game 3 to win the series 2-1. On the other side, Toronto's playing Boston, which at this point in time seems to be a bad matchup for Boston. Toronto beats them regularly. 1-0 win in Toronto in double overtime in the first game. 2-1 win for Toronto at home in the second game. Then they go into Boston and win in overtime 3-2. In the Stanley Cup final, it's the Blackhawks and the Toronto Maple Leafs. Well, Toronto hasn't been doing well in Stanley Cup finals, and that continues. Chicago goes into Toronto, wins the first game 3-1. Toronto roars back, wins the second game by a score of 5-1. But then Chicago goes home, and they close it out. They win 2-1 and 4-1 respectively to win the series in 4. Absolutely huge upset. That's a team that finished 20 points ahead of them in a 48-game schedule, and they beat them in the Stanley Cup final. So I am sure if that happened now, you'd see a completely reasonable reaction from everybody on the internet. If a team, 20 points behind, that'd be like the equivalent of about 30, 35 points behind. I'm sure there wouldn't be any complaints about, if that team was in the other division, they wouldn't have made it at all. They shouldn't have been in the playoffs to start with. It's a good story, though, that a team that's 11 games below 500 wins the Stanley Cup. And never done again. There were below 500 teams that got to the Stanley Cup final after this, certainly. But yeah, winning a Stanley Cup when you've had a miserable regular season, it's not usually the way things go. But there you go. So surprising end of the season. And of course, with the Maroons out starting tomorrow, there will be one column for all 7 teams. And eventually we get to 6. And by eventually, I think we're 4 videos away from being down to 6. And we're in the original 6 era then for about 25 videos. So there you go. Let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.